GPT 5.6 Sol, Claude Opus 4.8, and Gemini 3.6. Flash all claim to be the coding agent you should be running right now, and I pulled the pricing pages, the benchmark scores, and the deployment docs to find out which one actually backs that up. The biggest surprise isn't who wins on raw intelligence. It's that the model with the loudest spec sheet number turns out to have a context window that shrinks by nearly 75% the moment you actually open your terminal. Let's start with what these things actually cost you, because that number changes everything once you're running thousands of calls a day. GPT 5.6 Sol charges $5 per million input tokens and $30,000 per million output tokens, according to official pricing. Claude Opus 4.8 comes in a little cheaper on output at $25 AUD per million, with the same $5 AUD input price. And then there's Gemini 3.6 Flash, sitting at $1.50 per million input tokens and $7.50 per million output tokens. Do that math, and Gemini is roughly 3.3 times cheaper than GPT 5.6 Sol on both input and output. It's also 3.3 times cheaper than Claude Opus 4.8 on those same two numbers. Claude's output price is about 17% lower than GPT 5.6 Sol's, which sounds like a small win until you remember Claude also delivers strong coding results, so that discount doesn't cost you much in capability. There's a hidden detail buried in GPT 5.6 Sol's pricing too. Once you cross 272,000 tokens of context, the input price doubles. Cached tokens tell a similar story. Gemini's cached input runs 0.27 per million, nearly half of what GPT 5.6, Sol, and Claude Opus 4.8 both charge at 0.50 per million. If you're scaling this to real usage at 500,000 output tokens a month, Gemini 3.6 Flash costs you about $3.75. GPT 5.6 Sol costs $15 for that same volume, and Claude Opus 4.8 lands at $12.50. Gemini wins this test clean, no asterisk needed. That's not something you see on the marketing page. It's something you find in the fine print, and it matters if you're feeding it large files or long conversations. I went through the official model cards, the vendor pricing pages, and independent benchmark aggregators like Artificial Analysis and Vellum for all three of these models, so what you're getting here is the sourced data, not marketing copy. One of the biggest problems I run into when using AI agents is turning their output into YouTube content I can actually use to market my product. That's why this video is sponsored by Subscriber, a tool that helps business owners connect their AI agents to YouTube and market their products without spending 10 hours every week creating content. You can connect Claude or ChatGPT directly to Subscriber. It then analyzes your business, website, and YouTube channel to help you create SEO-optimized video ideas, scripts, thumbnails, and even complete videos that actually match your brand. What I like most is that every week, Subscriber gives me a list of high-potential video ideas I can immediately execute, and it can even help edit videos for me, with or without my face, including videos like the one you're watching right now. It's easy to get started, and you can try Subscriber for free using the link in the description below. Now back to the video. Now the part everyone actually watches these videos for: which one writes better code? On SWE Bench Verified, a benchmark built on real GitHub issues instead of toy problems, GPT 5.6 Sol scores 96.2%. Claude Opus 4.8 comes in at 88.6%. Gemini 3.6 Flash doesn't have a published figure here, so that's an honest gap rather than a loss. On Terminal Bench 2.1, which measures agentic terminal task completion, GPT 5.6 Sol posts 88.8% in standard mode, and it can push that to 91.9% in its ultra mode using parallel sub-agents. Claude Opus 4.8 scores 74.6% on that same test using the Terminus 2 harness, and Gemini 3.6 Flash lands at 78.0%, actually beating Claude here. But Claude Opus 4.8 doesn't leave empty-handed. On SWE Bench Pro, a harder and more realistic coding benchmark, Claude actually wins outright, scoring 69.2% against GPT 5.6 Sol's 64.6%. Gemini 3.6 Flash trails at 58.7%. On Deep SWE, GPT 5.6 Sol scores 72.7%, and Gemini 3.6 Flash falls way behind at 49%, a real gap on agentic coding work specifically. And on the Artificial Analysis Coding Agent Index, GPT 5.6 Sol tops the board at 80 points. added up across every major coding benchmark, and GPT 5.6 Sol wins this test. It's not close on SWE Bench Verified or Terminal Bench. Claude Opus 4.8 is a strong, consistent second, with one genuine win of its own. Gemini 3.6 Flash is clearly built for something other than heavy agentic coding. That's the one coding test where Claude Opus 4.8 beats GPT 5.6 Sol directly, and it's worth remembering, because it's not a small margin. Coding capability doesn't matter much if you're sitting there waiting on the response. On standard output speed, Gemini 3.6 Flash runs at 220.6 tokens per second, according to artificial analysis. GPT 5.6 Sol runs at about 54.6 tokens per second, and Claude Opus 4.8 is close to that at roughly 56 tokens per second. That means Gemini is close to 4 times faster than either of the other two in standard mode. Time to first token tells an even bigger story. Gemini 3.6 Flash gets you a first token in about 12 to 15 seconds. GPT 5.6 Sol, when pushed into max or reasoning mode, can take around 154 seconds before you see anything at all. That's over 2.5 minutes of silence before the model even starts responding. If you're iterating quickly on a problem, that delay breaks your entire workflow. Now, GPT 5.6 Sol does have an answer for this. There's an ultra-fast tier running on Cerebras hardware that promises up to 750 tokens per second, which would make it up to 14 times faster than its own standard mode. Claude Opus 4.8 has its own fast mode too, running around 2.5 times faster than standard, which lands at near 140 tokens per second when engaged. Judged on what you can actually count on right now in standard modes across published numbers, Gemini 3.6 Flash wins speed decisively. But that's community reported and still in limited preview, not something you can reliably build a workflow around today. Stick with me because the last 4 tests are where this decision actually flips. On paper, this test looks almost like a tie. GPT 5.6 Sol advertises a 150,000 token context window. Claude Opus 4.8 sits at 1,000,000. Gemini 3.6 Flash comes in at 1,048,576. Those numbers are close enough that context window alone shouldn't decide anything here. Max output is where there's a real, usable difference. GPT 5.6 Sol and Claude Opus 4.8 both cap at 128,000 output tokens. Gemini 3.6 Flash caps at 65,536, half of what the other two allow in a single response. If you're generating long files or big multi-file outputs in one pass, that ceiling matters. Here's the part marketing pages don't want you to notice. That 1.05 million token headline for GPT 5.6 Sol is the maximum, not what you get in daily use. In Codex CLI as of July 2026, the effective context has been reported at 258,400 tokens, community reported but unverified. It's not a lie, but it's a number built for a slide, not for your terminal. Even accounting for that, GPT 5.6 Sol still edges this test on the strength of matching Claude's 128K output, while technically leading on paper context. Gemini's 65K output cap is the real limitation here for anyone doing long-form generation. That's a massive gap between the number on the pricing page and what you actually get inside the tool most developers use to run this model. Where can you actually run these things, and what can you feed them? GPT 5.6 Sol lives on OpenAI's API and Azure OpenAI, plus Codex and ChatGPT work as front ends. That's a solid but narrow footprint. Claude Opus 4.8 spreads much wider. It's available through Bedrock, Vertex AI, and Microsoft Foundry, across roughly 30 Bedrock regions according to AWS documentation. Gemini 3.6 Flash takes a different kind of win. It accepts text, image, video, and audio input, plus PDFs, the widest input modality range of any of the three. GPT 5.6 Sol handles text and image. Claude Opus 4.8 handles text, image, and PDF. None of the three generate anything but text as output. So this test splits 3 ways. Claude Opus 4.8 wins on cloud reach. Gemini 3.6 Flash wins on modality breadth. GPT 5.6 Sol is solid but the most limited here, tied to OpenAI's own stack. That's the broadest enterprise deployment reach of the three by a clear margin. GPT 5.6 Sol wins on raw coding capability, 96.2% on SWE Bench verified, and 88.8% on Terminal Bench 2.1, with the top score on the Artificial Analysis Coding Agent Index. It's also technically ahead on paper context and output ceiling. Claude Opus 4.8 wins where consistency counts, taking SWE Bench Pro at 69.2% against GPT's 64.6%, and it has the widest enterprise deployment footprint across Bedrock, Vertex, and Foundry, while undercutting a GPT-5.6 Sol's output price by 17%. Gemini 3.6 Flash wins on cost and speed outright, running 3.3 times cheaper on both input and output than GPT 5.6 Sol, and nearly 4 times faster at 220.6 tokens per second. It also handles the widest range of input types. For most people, GPT 5.6 Sol wins. It dominates every major coding benchmark that matters: SWI Bench Verified, Terminal Bench, and the Coding Agent Index, and it's the most capable coding agent available right now on paper and in practice. That's the default pick if you want peak capability and the price isn't a deal breaker. But if you're shipping production code and consistency matters more than raw benchmark scores, Claude Opus 4.8 is the safer bet. The community consensus, echoed directly in user feedback, is that Claude is the one that doesn't do random things inside a real codebase, and its win on SWE Bench Pro backs that up with actual numbers. And if you're working at high volume or on lower stakes tasks, Gemini 3.6 Flash at 750 per million output tokens and 220.6 tokens per second is close to a no-brainer. My default, GPT 5.6 Sol for peak capability, Claude Opus 4.8 for production reliability, Gemini 3.6 Flash for cost and speed. That 1.05 million token context window GPT 5.6 Sol advertises is the headline number on the pricing page. In Codex CLI, as of July 2026, the effective context has been reported at just 258,400 tokens, community reported, but unverified. Before you build a workflow around that million token promise, know that what you get in the tool you're actually using can look very different from what's on the spec sheet. If you want to see how these three handle a real multi-file refactor instead of just benchmark scores, that's the video to watch next.